The next speaker, I would just like to say, due to a mistake in our modeling of this event, the next speaker has moved into the category of removed, which is a pity. He hasn't passed away, he just slipped out. And so what we will do is we will move on to the third speaker. And afterwards, Mike Weinstock, Director of Emerging Technologies and Design, agreed to give a short ad hoc talk about the topic, and then we will move on to the podium discussion. What? Yeah, let me see. This one. Please, if we could just avoid larger groups of people walking out, because we will be quite swift with switching, and this will be rather disturbing if people walking out while somebody is talking. So maybe we can take a short break after the next
Yeah, but it's not showing anything. Oh yeah, here it is. No. Here's full screen. Which one was full screen? Here we go.
Yeah.
Just a normal. No. Where is it? Take it.
I would like to welcome Theo Lorenz, which I think is a bit more familiar face in the school. Theo is going to actually give this talk on his own, so John Bell had unfortunately go to Miami. Unfortunately for us, I guess. Theo is actually unit master of Diploma Unit 9, and he's also an architect and media designer. He's a co-founder of the network of multimedia architecture and design, in short, NOMAD. And that indicates that actually his interest and his research that he's doing is happening on one hand in the academic realm, and on the other hand, actually in his private practice. I think what Theo is going to talk about is the interrelation between real-time interactive systems in relation to simulation techniques and technology. So as a vehicle for doing so, he's going to use an exhibition or an installation that has just happened last Friday in the Toyo Ito Pavilion at the Battersea Power Station. And I think that's what we're going to see.
First of all, I want to say we have actually quite similar problems. We have to communicate with normal people. And hence architecture is always, as well, only existing in this mode of representation. And how can we actually communicate that with clients, or actually with the users of the building afterwards, and actually keep this communication alive whilst we're working? So there are actually quite a lot of similarities as well in the way we kind of approach it. How do we make something visible already while we design it, we research it, and hence how is that already a part of the design. As John is not here, unfortunately in Miami, as Achim pointed out already, I have him here virtually. We were quickly interviewed at the opening of the exhibition and made some, I don't know, spontaneous remarks to the exhibition. I hope this is clearly to hear. And afterwards I start with introducing 3 of the installations we have there.
Right. So what we're trying to do in the unit is to think about notions of interface, think about how architecture might not be bounded by the same kinds of traditional static conceits in terms of boundary, in terms of program, and in terms of use. And so these pieces are really a first attempt to try to take a critical view on how architecture might be more fluid, how it might be expressed in terms of a program and an approach which, while embracing technology, still retains some notion of inhabitability. And in this case, profound sense of interaction.
Yeah. The exhibition is called Extensions because actually what we think is that you do not start from tabula rasa with architecture anymore. Nevertheless, you want an ongoing interaction to happen throughout the project. This is true for the planning phase, and therefore a lot of the projects are actually as well usable during planning, not only as an installation, but in the same manner as well as parts and parasites towards a big project. And we are lucky enough to be able to test it with a power station project, which is just next to us. And
we're not seeing this as being a panacea for architecture or architectural education, but rather there's the possibility for some part of architecture, which is after all an incredibly broad discipline, to address issues which are not necessarily bounded by conventional notions of structure, conventional notions of inhabitation, or perhaps conventional notions of program. And this is important for us in an age of information, of an increasing reliance on dynamic systems, to allow architecture to become in some way informed by these less tangible media, to think about boundaries in new ways, and to think about what it might be to make an architecture for the 21st century, rather than looking back to more traditional notions of building, let's say.
For us, it's as well completely clear that everybody gets used to real-time developments and everything has to be content management and reaction just in time. So just architecture is not doing that. So these installations are beginnings of actually misusing existing systems, which are all over buildings already nowadays, in order to help this problem. How can you change an environment dramatically with little moves instead of big shifting walls or something like that?
So while these things are prototypes, while they simulate potential architectures, they also, by the virtue of that, they have to work. They have to perform at real time, at real scales, immediately shorten the distance between the great difficulty that architects have, because architects, after all, don't make buildings. In general, architects can only represent something which isn't there.
Yeah, and with this I want to go on to the presentation. That was last Friday, and quite spontaneously, as you could see. However, it shows our main interests. How can we communicate architecture as well, work in a true way within this communication? We will show 3 installations, which we call instrumental installations, which we produced together with Battersea Power Station and Parkview International, within and with the help of Grimshaw Architects. It's an immense big project which keeps on having the same problem over and over again, that the content of it is changing constantly. It's one of the biggest developments happening at the moment in London. It should contain entertainment, leisure, retail. However, how can you actually communicate a continuously changing background for a project which will last or take at least 10 years before it actually starts building, with consultants all over London, I believe 5 different architect groups involved. So the communication becomes a key interest within a project like this. Our installations should be opening doors in a way for how you can start communicating with people in practice, but as well within teams in order to design constantly changing systems. And I believe all the three projects we have here today will show aspects of that. The first project is from second. As it is.
Basically, react to when you want to because you are reacting to yeah, you have to have following. You don't follow.
At the beginning, the team tried to lay out all the interests they had within a dimensional diagram, which is pretty easy for us nowadays. We can lay out things, relate them, and read them within the virtual space without any problems. It's pretty easy scripting within two-dimensional language, so quite similar then to Stellar in a way. We lay out things, we know how they're related to each other, and we can link back to different topics we were interested in. So it's getting understandable as well for others outside the team, and it's able to be misused by them as well. So through this we can reread the kind of research again and again. But if we want to, so this is a very simple script in Director, which is used throughout the unit, Direct 2D or 3D, in this case it's a fake 3D, so it's 2D. But as soon as we want to bring this into the environment of a physical environment or an actual environment, we start having problems so far. So what we are using in the unit is MaxMSP, which is not very different to Stellar. It's a visual scripting language. We can relate things to each other and make these independency loops within them. But the big advantage is it takes media information, so from sensors or music or any input, and can put out the same kind of information, so movement, actuate, motors, and any kind of thing. Similar programs are used all over the architecture already for management systems, content systems, which are existing. So in this case, visual information is collected within a grid where people are sitting. This is in the corner here. Transformed to Jitter and Cyclops, which are two plugins for this program, into media information, which is then distributed to the different actuators of the screen, which we saw before. Important is that the whole way of thinking of the team and the communication already has to adjust to this kind of organization as well. So we think in a way the working mode of a team to the same way it functions afterwards as an installation. So first testing, and it became quite complex in the end. So doesn't look too dissimilar to the film thing you showed before. And as well, we can adjust little data in there. So the sensitivity to certain mechanisms, areas within this gridded field. And so we can test it against the real environment and different users. And the nice thing about it is the user and as well the team can misuse it as well. So can start using it in a way we haven't thought it before, hence come to new conclusions within it. Here's some little tests that I've been doing beforehand in a little maquette. And up in our unit space. And you can see it's different than working in front of the computer just twisting a model. Already that is a nice advantage, but in this way you have a real effect right away and can then go back to the computer and adjust all the systems. Another one of those. And in the actual site, we had the exhibition in the Toyota Pavilion at the power station. The power station is right behind it. Obviously, for a triangulated surface, it's quite a nice background. And finally, over the whole evening, time-lapse of it working. The most interesting about it was actually the reaction of the users. Hence, Partly International came out and the different managers all have different ideas how to apply it. Some as a working model of finding out what movement and how they should be, some as a straight installation, which I've seen installations, which one of which we see in this room, and I think we should go on to this first, and you can change to the other one. I would believe it would be the best if everybody just gets up and come to the front, because it depends on interactivity, as we claim. around just by moving your body. In order to make it easier within a half-dark environment, they're wearing gloves which are easy to register with black clothes, as architects have. What this is showing is a research information they collected within the power station, as well interest groups, and it's becoming a kind of playful survey, what people are interested in. The user is navigating through a 3D space just by his own movement, as you just can see Puan is doing it, and can actuate movies within that. Through the activating of it, it goes to a log file and makes a logbook of all the interests happening within this virtual, or in this case, actuated space. Again, the big advantage is as well that it's not only used in the way it should be, that people start playing around and start misusing it. So if they really just want to mess it up in a way, they can just go over one thing again and again. And the result will be different, but it can be fed back into changed result into the system and change the play rules in a way through that as well. Yeah, so if anybody wants to try, we have another pair of nice gloves. And those are already there. Your tie might be a problem, actually. You stand in front of the camera.
Yeah.
So in fact, just use your tie. You see, it's a program made for architects because we all wear black.
Yeah. So what am I doing? This is giving me access to down here.
Yes.
So if I do render that, what do I get?
Go sideways. If you take the yellow hand down.
What am I triggering? I'm getting a left movement.
Yeah, it's
On what?
on the camera itself.
What we're saying is images change.
Yeah.
Scale.
When it's easy if you try one because let's say the red, so you keep your yellow one behind. Yeah, they go forward.
While selecting is with fewer movements, not too big and high.
You go backwards.
I think we can solve questions while it's going on. Yeah, while the question anyway, so we can for anything necessary.
So you can apply this to one of the ways information.
Okay, so
To me, these two installations are very interesting and seductive, but at the moment, I don't see their value beyond entertainment and game. Where do you see them, or how can they? Maybe can they be used for potentially commercial applications, or how do you see their evolution?
First of all, we work with a client that is a power station in Parkview, which we're very excited about the opportunities these things offer, which are, for example, that they can involve a different kind and different user groups within the development of their site, testing them and having a feedback loop within this, and therefore having a constant update on content. All the projects are used in a different direction, obviously. So, as I said, the first one was on survey. Systems which are anyways, I think, 30% almost of the cost of a project like that. are going into a lot of this kind of surveying system all over the site. There's 30 acres of town developing there, but it's just there, sitting somewhere in a back room. If you bring back the loop of it and make it actually part of the architecture, then it's not this kind of half-used thing anymore. You make it active for the architecture, and activating again new areas within the building. This one is the most clear within the planning process, because it's such a long planning process, and the involvement of the society around it is really difficult. So what you want to do is bringing people in through entertainment, which is never wrong, because that triggers interest. But as well be able to give them the chance of giving statements within that, but having a direct contact to the people on site. The architectural implications of it will be parasitic to the existing design. So there won't be complete tabula rasa new designs of house station. Grimshaw does have a design, if we like it or not. But they have big problems with the content of it. So does Parkview International, because it's changing all the time, because potential tenants are changing because they don't know what they're dealing with. These installations are obviously a first attempt of bringing those groups together, communicating how we can develop the architecture further in order to be updatable at all times.
I mean, I can see how the user can interact once the building is up and the installation is set into place, but then what is the value for the planning process that is before?
It's kind of the same, because it's not different, because during the planning, it's not, especially at Battersea Power Station, it's not an 1, 2, 3 step planning anymore. It's a communication at all times. So the same kind of need for interactivity of the people is within the planning team. So we need to as well there trigger interest in them to communicate and exchange data why they are planning what at what time. There's 5 big architects working on it, and several other offices and practices, and in fact they just installed a content management system where they can exchange data in a very basic way, but that's not interesting enough already. It kind of failed already because most of the people are not using it. And so it's really very parallel. If you do not update the system constantly at all times, as well with interest, it starts failing, and then it's not good for anything anymore. Did that answer your question, kind of? I mean, if you see that, like compared to a conventional architecture thing, what you exchange are plans and sections and other similar representations of the architecture. The architect itself is the only one who really can think beyond what's really in there. Everybody else has to read the plan in a way he is told. So this thing starts getting the opportunity of actually changing the perception of the architect as a user. So the influence on the actual design should be becoming bigger and bigger within the process.
I haven't seen any link to the topic of today, which is simulation. I was wondering if you're simulating something there with these installations.
In the way we work, research, simulation, realization becomes kind of almost equivalent, because the simulation, as they already exist during planning and designing, they will exist in a similar way as well, still in the ready installation and in the further project. So there is a collapse of this differentiation, and which we need as well in order to have this continuous feedback loops, which we were talking about before as well. How can we check what we're doing in a way? And this is only have it there in one-to-one, virtually or real, so as a working thing. So it's testable, definitely.
What's really interesting is that probably the most obvious example of the way that something similar is happening is in Allsop's office, where they've established a film unit for working on regeneration schemes and getting people behind them, and they also do art projects and things. Why did you choose installation in particular media to do a similar thing, to work with community-based things? What was your choice of installations over, say, films, or art, or
this particular installations? I mean, they're group works of different student groups, which involve out of interest of the different groups as well. Obviously, the beginning was starting with as well the programs we're using, and we're using all day anyways, which is direct, and for us it becomes very normal. But then bringing that out to the users, and actually our special projects is involved in the power station project as well. So there's of course a loop. The software is originally coming from VJs, so visual jockeys and video artists, but obviously it's a very, very direct media where people interact with. And
do you have a particular kind of idea of your user in mind? Is it someone young? Is it someone old, or you want to cross?
Obviously we want 100% use. That's the kind of optimum. And during the installation, we could see actually people from the age of 1 up to 80 involving in the system for quite a long time. We were actually quite amazed about that, how well it worked already with very simple installations like this. I think obviously in order to fine-tune that, things like that have to develop. They're 2 months projects. Nevertheless, I believe it's not just young and hip, because it could be one of the first things. In an installation in the Toyota Pavilion, obviously we do it like that. But you do not have to have the direct projections onto the screen. It could just secretly form the space. Nevertheless, you activate it with the same scripts and medias. And the awareness of the user can be always a different one. Is it like the one standing in front of the video shop and knowing that you're on the camera? Or is it something that you start noticing that people start gathering around you because it's coming from another thing? So that's certainly an interest of us, how we can widen the audience more and more. But certainly it's a bigger audience than having some plans in the middle of a room and people interact with that.
But it's very difficult because you're competing against commercial media in a way for people's attention, and there's conventions of commercial media like computer generation or computer games, which have obviously got quite a lot of investment and a lot of money behind them to get people's attention.
We actually sometimes collaborate even with them, so which is a good thing, and seek to do that more and more. Yeah.
Can you answer why that you seem to mostly be interested in a gestural interface?
Gestural interface?
Yeah, all these projects are about gestural interfaces, and I know a lot of people have done a lot of work on interface.
That one is not so much yet, but obviously...
Well, but it is, though.
Yeah,
I mean, a dance is sort of... I mean, it's all about sort of larger physical movements as means of controlling things, as opposed to a traditional control with a keyboard, which is fine motor, or with a mouse, which is also fine motor. I mean, why the interest in these larger gestural kind of methods?
There are different starting points and answering points for that. First of all, we're dealing with an urban scale project where the interest lies in the mass of the people and how they behave within there and how you trigger them. But in the same way, bring then to an individual a response back. So noticeable response to a single user. So probably we'll be dealing within the power station with bigger like clustering of people rather than individuals. So fine motoric is always possible on little terminals or something like that, but obviously that would never capture a kind of mass of people wandering about. So that's one answer. And purely technical as well, coming from video installation and VJ software, obviously that's one thing which works quite straight, even though it's quite complicated as well. Any sensor could be attached to it. It could be fine humidity sensors you can transform into MIDI sensors. But in this case, for an exhibition as we had, where people should straight go into it and work with it, this was most appropriate. But certainly, I know already 1 or 2 projects will go in this very fine monitoring of existing management system within the power station and things like that.
Would it be fair to say that one could read your projects as skilling systems, not unlike flight simulators, for instance, except what people skill themselves to is partly in their own decision and partly determined by the information available in the tool, and that the connection to the gesture is actually somehow drawing people out of their normal motorics or ways of retrieving information, so to speak, and that one could actually say it could be quite intentional to make people go through pretty weird physical gymnastics to kind of skill themselves in a way that so that actually the movement is part of the skilling, it's part of the displacement necessary for the skilling. Would it be fair to say?
In some parts, certainly. I mean, a flight simulator already is like the real plane. It has absolutely the same technology within it. It just is not in the air. It just controls the computer instead of the real technology of the thing. So if we're already that far, I would be really happy. So obviously, it's skilling for both sides. It's for us as architects, how do we design and how to communicate, and as well for the client, how does he understand and integrate into this kind of design process. So skilling, yes, but as well for the machines itself, let's say, or the installations, because through the fine-tuning of them, we have this kind of feedback loop at all times, in a way. If it doesn't work, then we have to do something about it, and so on and so on. So ideally speaking, we would come to this kind of combination of collective intelligence, individual intelligence, and artificial intelligence, which feed from each other through a visual intelligence.
Maybe it would be quite interesting to have a remark or question from David.
Will that do? I was just thinking of your question about why is it big physical gestures that we're picking up on. One is that there's something rather perverse here in that what we're doing is bringing our red-gloved right arm up in order to pick up the signal, please move upwards. Now, what you might say is there is something vastly more natural about getting someone to do that, to indicate that they want to move up, than there is in moving over there on their keyboard and pressing a button up there with an up arrow on it. That's very artificial. So in that sense, doing this, this, and this is much more natural. The really complex thing going on here, as we're doing this terribly natural thing, is that when we want to find out more about something, what have we got to do? Mouse click. We're back entirely into a convention, the way Bill Gates has brainwashed all of us, except actually this is prior to Bill Gates. And I was thinking, what would the gesture be? Tell me more about this, and maybe it says something about my age, but I was thinking opening a book would be the gesture I would associate with I want to know more about this. But anyway, look how natural it is compared with how most of us interact with a computer. That's the best you're going to get.
Continuing his remark, I wanted to know if you can see this as a prototype to actually design a physical environment, less than a virtual, as this can be evolved into something that can be a physical environment less than something added into an existing structure.
I mean, in a way, it is physical because you have to behave with it and within it, and that's true for all three of them presented today. The potentials are lying in any direction of where you have to actuate anything within the architecture. Naturally, that won't be usually the biggest part of the architecture, so not the tabula rasa we start building the structure and test against this necessarily. But how does it function and how we test against the functioning, that could be part of it. And I think what we try is not to have this division anymore where it becomes physical, because it is already physical while we're designing. Not every project knows yet where it's going, and actually it's a teamwork and it will divide up in 3 or 4 people, and so in 4 different directions. But now the big advantage is they do not have to start from scratch with using, again, just 3D Max or Maya. They can go on and have this as an actual tool with an actual testing ground, with actual clients, and develop something further through that.
I just wonder if we link this question and your answer to the previous question of skilling devices, self-skilling and skilling somehow, let's use the word user for lack of a better word. Would you see your mechanisms somehow become ubiquitous, somehow emerge, is immersed and therefore less visible, or don't your mechanisms somehow live off the fact that they are not immersed within the built environment and that they're kind of quite distinguishable and offer themselves, therefore, quite dramatically to playing with them, skilling oneself with them?
I mean, we need the interaction, and if the interaction comes from less visible things, then it will have maybe less visible outputs, maybe it will have extremely visible outputs because it was invisible before. So actually, I do not want to judge if it has to be like big moving things or just a little valve opening and letting fresh air in. I mean, a very good example is what we see at the Tate Modern at the moment, where just one single installation, a mirrored ceiling and some humid air transforms the space bigly. I mean, like, as I haven't seen it before. So, but this could be actually, this is always the same now, but this could be actuated and changed to the behavior of the audience lying there on the floor, for example. So, yeah, there is a degree between completely invisible to completely visible, but the importance is how you actually bring the, yeah, but it's not completely, because it's always a representation of what it is. If it's something silent, it will be represented silently as well, in a way. So.
I just wanted to get back to the issue of simulation, and what I can see here is some kind of simulation of a physical way of moving objects around. So you simulate a physical process, which is far less. There it's very clear and very connected, but then this installation is far less clear.
Mm-hmm.
So I've just wondered if you could say a little bit more about, more connected to the issue of simulation, because this obviously, and I find this very nice, because it's obviously a total different aspect of simulation than in David's former speak, and that's what was our intention of this day, to bring this special, or these different perspectives together.
I mean, as Michael already said at the beginning, it's not that easy to define simulation. And as in this case, a simulating program, which is adjustable within fine tunes, very similar to Stellar. So you can set variables and adjust them to each other, clarify which loops are related to each other, have at all times already a real output, an actual. So it's not so easy to say anymore when it stops being a simulation or just a representation or is the actual, because it at all times should ideally be all three of it.
I think that's actually an interesting question, because I think what you started off with is somehow if you really take it literally, the interaction between at least two systems, no? Mm-hmm. So I was wondering where in which of these investigations that you do, you're really investigating the model that you set up, and then in which way you actually change and intervene in that model, and you actually really create a feedback loop that goes beyond navigating through a kind of model, no? Or actually rather a navigational means of investigating that model. So I think that it would be quite interesting to, especially in the context of a simulation symposium, to investigate where do you see in the different installations the setup that you really start to create feedback loops between dynamic systems.
If I just talk about this as two installations, here we have a very straightforward log file in a way. And so we have a kind of datascape which can be put back into the system, and therefore changing the original setup of it. Whereas here it's more really about the interaction of the remote and the local. Again, it could be locked, but in a way you have the effect of something non-simulated, somebody real somewhere out there through a simulation system which you cannot foresee at all. Therefore, you cannot predict the next step at all. So I think that there's a nice discipline there.
Could I perhaps suggest, since the discussion is already evolving, could I perhaps suggest that we move with the speakers to the table, and that Mike was going to say something as a kind of introduction and as a little elaboration to the discussion. So maybe if I could ask David and Theo to come forward.
I need this? Oh, do I need this? Normally when you have another kind of feedback when you have two microphones. Okay, I'm going to speak for a few minutes, but it's going to be very ad hoc, partly because Michael only told me a very short time ago I'm going to be talking, and partly because finding an effective way to talk about simulation that's not incredibly techy is difficult. So I want to start with something that Marx said. Marx said, the future has arrived, but it's arrived earlier than we expected. And that's Groucho Marx rather than Karl Marx. But it's a very important consideration for us. And I think as architects, and generally as people who say are architects of information, we're obsessed with a kind of futuricity. And I'm not going to try and redress that, but I am going to do a small digression into the kind of origin and ways of working with the thought about what a model is, what a representation is, what is simulation. And it may not clarify anything, it may just give you a kind of better picture. There are people who say that what we're dealing with today is a kind of collision of ideas about knowledge with computation. There are philosophers and systems people who just kind of define a contemporary world as that's what's happening. And in particular, I think this is happening in architecture. And whether it's good or bad in a way is completely irrelevant. There are several comments that Theo made that I will pick up on in a minute. But you need to just cast your mind back to when the word model was first put forward, which is Greek, and was mathematical in origin. Architects, if they did do a building, would spend something like 35 years doing the building. If you were commissioned, you would move to the site. You're a person of a good family. You had some knowledge of maths. And you'd be spending pretty much your whole life solving the problems of putting this thing up. There wasn't any design work. There was no information structure. There was no real technology for you to master. Everybody knew what the design was. Like Greek temple has got a few variations, but if that's not a design issue, it was kind of understood within the world then what the building was to be. And everybody who was knowledgeable, educated, had a kind of mental model or representation of that building. And your job as the architect was to stay there and make sure and solve the problems of how to put it up. And you made sure you had the right people who knew how to cut the stone, or knew how to lay out the geometry of 3 dimensions to make a wooden template so it could cut nicely, and you made sure people got paid, and you did all that kind of stuff. Architectural models, as we think of as the kind of fixed, static object that has no time duration connected with it, really come into their own in the Renaissance. Very elaborate wooden models. At the same time, you can see in mathematics a radical change. In the Greek mathematical history, you have a very important idea which is called proof. And in effect, that's an argument. That architects didn't have to prove their buildings, but mathematicians had to make proofs. And they had to do it in public, and they had to demonstrate and convince people. Around about in the Renaissance or late Renaissance, you start getting a much more different idea both in mathematics and architecture. Mathematics in particular becomes much more of an architectural tool. The first time, although there was no system of educating architects, nearly all of them, when you look at their history, were good mathematicians, geometers especially, but pretty much to be an architect meant to be a good mathematician. There were no drawings as such, and there was no information about a building other than general description, scale, model. Now, model in that sense is smaller than the real thing, but it contains all the features of the real thing. If it looks like it, you can measure off it, it's got all the components in it. They may be made of wood instead of stone, but it's got everything in it, just smaller. This is kind of really, really brief history, and I'm kind of fast-forwarding thousands of years very rapidly. Levi Strauss, which I'm ashamed to say I've forgotten the date, but I think it's around 1930, in a book called The Savage Mind, he's talking about bricolage. And he needs, bricolage, for those of you who don't know what the word means, is making stuff out of collecting lots of things that are already made and putting them together into a kind of new. And in a certain way, what he's talking about, although he was talking about mythology and so-called primitive societies, was a very accurate reflection of kind of concepts in mathematics and in general culture, the big change that the world went through in the 20s and 30s. There's a lot of complicated things out there. We don't really make new things. What we do is make new orders. Anyway, his description of a model was pretty much, he starts with the same position as in the Renaissance. The model is less than the real thing. As David said, in mathematical territory, it's something less. But in his case, he wants to model how myths change and travel over time. So he's the first person in the kind of general culture, not in mathematics, to start to try and describe a model that is constantly renewing itself and changing. It has no fixed form. So what he has to do to make a model of myths is concentrate on the features and how their relationships change to each other. So what's significant for Levi Strauss is not the actual features, it's not whether a jaguar or a mask or something is permanent, but how it changes its relation. And similarly in mathematics, I think this is your field too, you start to get kind of what nowadays we kind of very blandly call nonlinear mathematics. We concentrate more on how things change over time. The problem for contemporary architecture is that sometimes we get confused. We know we're supposed to be good at structure, but if we're only dealing with information, so our first resort when we're dealing with masses of information is the structure. This is the kind of architectural mode of thinking. Our concepts of model revolve around structure. If we try to make, as soon as we try to add dynamics to that, then we have certain kinds of very particular problems. And they cannot be solved or addressed from within architectural history or from within the resources of what I think you call conventional architecture. It's not a phrase that I use much or try not to, because I don't think there are any real conventions in architecture, any more than there are normal people and not normal people. And there are just differences. So the problem we have here is we're interested in things that change over time. What we have available to us is information, and what we make are elaborate, increasingly more and more elaborate data structures, and then we kind of move them around. And somehow, because they're moving, that's a dynamic structure. I think what we need to do, and what I hope the purpose of this symposium will be to ask kind of purposeful questions, is what are the nature of the models, not that we are making, but that we can usefully construct. There's a certain irony to sitting in an 18th century building talking about the future. And we need to kind of recognize that the world values permanence as much as it does impermanence. And we are, and I'm as seduced and interested by media structures, ephemeral things that come rapidly and go. But they're only possible within more durable frameworks. And this is one of the areas that we do not address at the moment in contemporary architectural discourse about dynamics, is differentiations have changed. We're totally concentrated on things that change like that are gone in seconds. We're not, I think, paying sufficient attention to making models, dynamic systems, simulations of the relations between things that move at different speeds. I think it's as important to have a dynamic system that models things for architecture over 20 years and 5 years as it is for over 20 days or 5 minutes. Okay. That's my kind of ad hoc stuff.
Actually, that's something I could... with the power station project, actually that's one of the main issues there as well. There are the kind of long time changes, slow time changes, and immediate changes, or as they call it, gradable, adaptable and changeable. So that's one of the reasons why we did choose this site, because the long-term things are unavoidable there. I mean, there is a power station, which is a landmark building. There is as well a framework of given architecture by Grimshaws. But how do we provide a content management within that? And if we look at content management within media design, it is a very rigid framework we have to construct first in order to allow for a constant change, not only of the designer, but as well of the user. And that's one of our interests as well, to go into that direction.
Okay. Well, if I was arguing for you, if I was working for you, I would be more emphasizing arguments about democratization of planning procedures. And I think that's probably one area where your kind of interest and your kind of work can be very, very useful. And again, that's, sorry to kind of harp on about the state of architecture, but, we have to turn our face to the outer world. We cannot go on, as I believe, contemporary architecture for the last 15 years has more or less addressed itself. Mm-hmm. And we have to be, one of the things we should be arguing for, I think, is that in planning procedures and the building for the physical world, we want to involve a lot more people. Planning procedures, at least in this country, and I don't know much about the rest of what I do know in the US, do not involve the general population at all. Sometimes there's sort of community projects which are normally small scale and low budget. If we could find more effective ways to involve people, I think probably we're slightly worried about doing that because we don't want to lose the kind of architectural vision. The problem with asking a lot of people is they might say, well, I just don't like what you've designed. Why can't I have it with kind of more pointy roof and a bit more of a Victorian facade? So I'm probably glad I'm not working for you because there's kind of a dilemma there. I mean, I did want to, if I could, kind of open the conversation a little bit about time to David, who one of the kind of characteristics of the 20th century is the permanence of certain commercial enterprises. And in some cases, when you really look at them, it's really quite remarkable. So if we, just a very simple example is something like Ford, a motor car company, how they've always, although some people say they're fetishized, and there have been conversations about deliberate obsolescence, but in a certain sense they have been one of the main drivers of technical innovation for I don't quite know how long is it? Model T was 1914, somewhere around there. Okay, so we're approaching 100 years where pretty much they've been at the forefront of driving new technology, which we make use of. Architecture hasn't driven technology. We don't invent new materials, new casting processes and procedures. We make use of them. And I wondered if you could say how those kind of organizations manage to constantly be introducing new things and still maintain their integrity as an organization.
Good question. Yeah, the endurance of companies is quite interesting. I think it used to be the case that the oldest company in the world that would be, of course, an organisation that by some definition you can trace back as being the same organisation. And I think it's one from the 15th century, and it's a Swedish mining firm. Okay? That's an awfully long time to last. What makes organisations last? Monopoly technological lock-in is a good one. Bill Gates. Okay. The ability to change and innovate your product is probably the most important one. There actually is, in fact, an article in Harvard Business Review by the man in Shell I used to work for, called Arie de Geus, called Planning as Learning, from about 1988, in which he talks about the only sustainable competitive advantage a company has is the ability to learn faster than its competitors. So I think organisations that learn and do new things is quite interesting. An example of this would be or a counterexample would be the Hansom Cab Company, which probably none of you have heard of. Anybody know what a Hansom Cab is? I won't ask you to define it. Right, okay. So, horse-drawn cab, streets of London, 100 years ago. You get in there in your top hat and get taken to some wonderful party or something. Right, the Hansom Cab Company thought that they were in the business of making horse-drawn luxury transport. Okay, that's why they don't exist anymore. Right, if they thought they were in the business of making luxury transport, they might be making Rolls-Royce. If they thought they were in the business of luxury transport of any kind, they might be making Learjets. If they thought they were in the business of luxuriously connecting people, they might be making mobile phones. So there's something here about company definitions of themselves and having an interesting combination of robustness and durability with ability to change and innovate. And getting that balance right is very difficult. I'm feeling as if I'm well off base from from what we're talking about here, but you asked me the question, so I thought I should answer it.
Actually, you can't be more on base, because actually that's the problem architecture has. So it's constantly updating itself as a process, reflecting itself towards its own domain, and as a finalized project in the end. I mean, the ability to change within architecture is incredibly slow, not only in built architecture, but as well in practices. I mean, knowing at what time they change as well, they best practice to something else. Installing knowledge management is something which is almost not existing within architecture. And in a lot of existing practices, is still the one-off idea which has to function until the very end from the first planning day. And the process of altering is always seen as something disturbing rather than as something helping. And there's always a big preciousness about everything a lot of architects do. And I believe that's something which is in business very different. This kind of all times ready to change and accept new influences. Something we really could learn from business more and more.
There I would like to come in. All times ready to change. No, don't believe the hype. Here's what we organise. This sounds like sort of organisations incredibly responsive, fast-moving, government employees, rubbishy, dusty moles would be the sort of the complete poles of this argument. Here's what we know about organisational change. It does not go on all the time. Firms create for themselves major strategic reorientations in a punctuated way. What you tend to see is organisations that make very big changes in their strategic orientation and then tend to spend long periods making minor changes as they get good at doing that. And there has been actually some system dynamics work on this. What is interesting is organisations, once they've decided the direction they're going in, then need to create the socialized patterns of working within the organisation and working with people outside the organisation to learn how to do that thing well. If an organisation keeps changing, it disrupts all of those social networks and makes irrelevant all of that knowledge. And an organisation that keeps changing, essentially, well, the way I put it is, it fidgets itself into destruction. It's a bit like you're sort of not working out which book you're trying to read at any given time and putting one down after 3 pages and picking up another. Okay? You forget the characters, so you never really get into it and get the pleasure from it. So organisations don't constantly change, and that's a good thing. The issue is, what is it that should produce punctuated change, make an organisation change now. It may be that my organisation has a way of doing things and your organisation has invented a new way of doing things, but because it's new, I can carry on for a while doing it the old way because my people are better at doing it that old way than your people who've got this new thing and you're still sort of getting the bugs out of the system. And also, your new way of doing it might fail. At some point, if it doesn't fail, I think I need to keep an eye on you because my skilled workers might not be as good at doing it the old way than your one. But that is a very interesting question. But organisations do not change all the time.
Could I ask one of the product designers to respond to that? I mean, in product design, you seem to have to respond maybe more rapidly and with higher turnover of ideas and materials than architects do.
Yeah, it is. I don't know what to respond to actually, because of course in product design we have more rapid changes, and it depends on if we want to follow that rapid change or not. Because in product design, if you are in the domestic or normal retail, you should change according to trends and markets. But some successful products are not changed for the last 80 years and still.
Yeah. So let me sort of prompt you into kind of more specific area to do kind of models and simulation. There seems to be in architecture an idea that you will make a radical or radically new architecture. In order to do that, that you have to have radically new models and radically new ways of working and kind of organization within the design team and so forth. Do you have the same syndrome?
I think that I do one of the oldest mass manufactured products in the world, like porcelain, and there one of the most radical changes comes actually because of new technology, or not because of new technology, but because of some people see possibilities in the new technology that is not meant for that, or the technology is made for reproducing the old kind of products, and then some people are using the technology in a new way. So in making a cup, it's basically made the same way today as it was when Wedgwood started making the cup. So I think that it's correct that you have to reorganize some parts of the system to get new changes, real changes.
Okay, since we are discussing simulation here today, and since we are about to discuss change, I would like to ask the table to maybe respond on the process of change in relation to the model as such. How we mentioned forecasting, and David said the system, or what he's doing is not about forecasting, but in a sense, and you mentioned the thought of the model is not something which was there all the time. So I feel there's something about this. As long as you set up a model for, let's say, as simple as for a building, you have some kind of forecast of what you're going to do, and yeah.
Could I just add one remark to that? Because we may quickly get caught in a certain discussion, because I think we probably need to draw a distinction between a model as it is used in the field of architecture and modeling as a more general term in relation to simulation. So maybe I could suggest that we talk about modeling rather than the model.
Okay. I actually think that most contemporary architects are moving towards or have already adopted something that they would like to be like the system dynamics model. I think we have stopped doing representational models of making images of what it would look like if it's built. As soon as you have an idea of time incorporated in a model, it becomes burdensome to keep asking the same question of the model, what will it look like? I also think that kind of what-if scenario, we say the idea that you make a model that you can, is something that you interrogate. It is quite widely, or beginning to be quite widely adopted in architecture. I think in other design fields and in manufacturing it's been so for quite a long time. And I think there's I'm not sure it's useful to try to reinvent the word model. I think at least in our world we are beginning to understand model as something that incorporates time, is something that you can ask questions of, rather than being a straightforward pictorial representation of what the thing will be look like if you could ever persuade someone to spend their money to build it. At least shall we say, in terms of what my mother would call kind of fancy architecture, or the avant-garde. If we go back to what David was saying, there's, the mainstream of building, 90% of building takes place through very straightforward, traditional methods of drawing, physical modeling. Speculations about future buildings, particularly in very sensitive, economically sensitive sites like the Battersea Power Station or very big cultural projects, I think there tends to be a longer and longer engagement with a kind of what-if scenario. I also don't think it's entirely beneficial, but maybe we can talk about the dangers another time.
I mean, but to model it's just a question, do we take the model as a guarantee, as a traditional model usually were? Like, there's my little model traditionally as a building, or that's my financial model, I 100% know if this is my model, it's my guarantee? Or do we take it as a potential and open, or as one variation of things we want to work with? And I believe the second is what becomes practice, because the guarantee can't be there anymore for within architecture, or less and less. I mean, what's happening to the financing of the building, what's happening to the tenants, and of course the smaller the project is, the easier it is to guarantee something. But yeah, that's something we all have to deal with. How much can we guarantee, or how much can we put forward as a model, which is an option or potential? But the more we offer just potentials, we have to again bring back the real-time democracy into it, like the agreement of the other, that they are not dealing with a guarantee but with a potential.
I would like to ask something, because I think we are in danger to getting the discussion hijacked in an architecture realm, actually. Because I think what I found striking is that in the first introduction that David gave, there are, with the image of the iceberg, he was talking about events and behavioral patterns and actually underlying structures of the system, which I think architecture starts to deal with, and actually architects really try to involve with. So I'm really wondering where actually I think why we come together is to see where actually across disciplines, how can you actually really set up models that can simulate behavior of dynamic systems that start to inform each other. And I think that's one of the issues that I think architecture is really interested in. So I think it's probably more worthwhile to discuss these issues. How do you actually set up such a model? How do you feed such a model? What are the variables? And what are the parametric constraints that you actually have to set? Because I think the limits are as important as the variables. I think that's more interesting to discuss than architectural planning processes and the way you intervene with them.
That's mine. I think I'm still struggling to cross this particular linguistic or discourse abyss, but let's struggle on. I was actually thinking of Levi Strauss and myths, and was wondering how the myth grew up in Britain that modern architecture is rubbish, whereas where the Germans love it and the Dutch love it and the Norwegians love it. Now there's an interesting model. How can different societies get to a very different view in how they embrace modern architecture? Yeah. Okay, that was an aside, but it was burning deep inside me. How do you set up models which inform each other? I don't understand that question yet. Can you tell me some more, and I will try to...
Well, I guess what simulation is about...
yeah, this rather louche kind of leaning against the columns, standing there in the shadows. You know, it's... Well, yeah, I mean, you're looking fantastic, but...
What I'm asking is actually, I think what we're trying, or why we are interested in simulation is that you actually realize that what we're dealing with are actually dynamic systems in the most general sense. And this is the same, I guess, for you as a system researcher. I'm sorry to forget the correct word. And I think that's also what architecture becomes more and more actually interested in. So I'm actually not talking about models in which one model informs the other, but how do you set up a model in which you actually have at least two systems that start to inform each other, and where do you have to set the constraints, and where do you actually have to set the variables? In the simplest case, actually, how do you actually can have an investigation in what kind of variables you have to change in order to make a bad movie commercially viable, or to have a good movie actually not performing commercially as you actually want to do that. There are certain variables that you can actually change, and there are certain constraints that you actually build into the model. And I think that's exactly the same interest we have in architecture. So the only suggestion I wanted to make is that we shift towards that discussion, because I think that's what is really interesting. Because then you could imagine that from actually these variables and from these constraints you can derive a generative tool, not just simulating certain scenarios that are more happening on the what-if basis.
There are a number of applications in my field, system dynamics, to, well, broadly speaking, the areas that you might be interested in. And I deliberately decided not to tell you about them today because I thought it might shut down the discussion. But let me mention them now, just in case they're what it is we should be talking about. I suspect they're not. There is system dynamics work on production management, which tells us the complicated process of how to manage large projects, be they erecting a building or creating a naval vessel or whatever. We can understand what happens to projects when they are delayed or when design changes come through. This is quite interesting and worth lots of money. I don't suspect that's what we want to talk about today, but I happily will. There is a tradition of work in system dynamics called urban dynamics. There's a book by J.W. Forrester, 1969, called Urban Dynamics, which is about the growth, stagnation and decline of cities, which is a kind of sort of city planning take on architecture, as it were. What mix of buildings do we need for a city to grow or stagnate? But now I can also imagine, I'm struggling to understand why it is that architects want to make their models dynamic. I mean, I can think of one, which is what happens in an area if we install a building of a certain type. I mean, I remember going and looking at Tate Modern when it was being converted. I don't know if you know that we have a cities and architecture and engineering program at the LSE run by Ricky Burdett, and Ricky showed us around showed us around Tate Modern, and was talking about the importance that they had attached to having the enormous hall open for many hours of the day. Now, it seems to me here is, in a sense, a model about the effect that museum will have on visitors, will have on the area around it. There is a piece of mental modelling going on there. So I can also imagine simulation work or modelling for what effect will the building have, what effect do we want it to have. Would you like to clarify your... No, not clarify, that's a judgment. Would you like to repeat your question again, or shall we discuss it?
I'll sort of pick it up a bit. In one way, we are used to, in structural engineering, of having dynamic models. If you the way a structural engineer will use a model, if you use finite element analysis or any of those other things, is a kind of optimization procedure, which is a lot like a bungee jumper leaping off the top of this building. So it will try and go all the way down, and it will bounce. And gradually, it will find its point of equilibrium. And what the software is doing is actually trying all the solutions, from the most extreme ones in either direction, until it eventually settles on a kind of compromised but most sensible arrangement. So, in a certain sense, our interest in design in dynamics we know it can be useful as a way of designing. The traditional way of designing was that you, one way and another, whether it was orange peel collage or mad drawing all night, you arrived at some kind of idea of a design, and then you physically modeled it, or you modeled it through a lot of drawings, and in a way it's a kind of description of something you thought of. We should say probably that idea of the process of making a design is one area where we're in architecture we're very interested in a dynamic system. That is, we want to design a system which, by varying the inputs or changing some of the parameters, we can produce a design in a way that's not a direct inspiration, not a vision that we like that we get in the bath.
That is what?
It's a process.
There's some need for clarification. I think what we are really interested in is actually really designing these interrelations between dynamic systems. I think what...
Can you give examples?
Yeah, I can give an example. For example, if you look at what traditionally the architectural model has been concerned with, actually the representation of the physical material articulation. No? So you actually have a representation of the wall that you build or the window that you build. Then obviously there are all kinds of dynamic systems that actually are modulated by that. Maybe the solar penetration, the light penetration, thermal conditions, environmental conditions, actually the way that sets up certain social and cultural agendas and regimes, and so on and so on. So there is actually a multiplicity of dynamic systems that are all manipulated through, or actually are all modulated through the manipulation of what architects usually do, which is somehow manipulating the way you assemble certain materials. So I think at that point, what we are interested in is how could you actually set up somehow a way of testing this interrelation between the dynamic systems that you deal with and actually what you're really doing as an architect, which is manipulating the assemblage of material systems. So I think that's, I guess in order to clarify what I'm trying to say is that there is more and more an awareness that you actually really deal with a lot of dynamic systems that are somehow catalyzed through the material articulation that you do. And I think later in the afternoon that's more obvious, because then we talk about or we were supposed to talk about environmental engineering, which is actually investigating computer fluid dynamic, or they use actually computer fluid dynamic models to see what is actually interrelation between many dynamic systems and the architecture, which is in that case the environment. And so I think that's the interrelation that I would be really interested in to discuss, because I think in that sense it's also about the event, behavioral patterns of these dynamic systems, and actually the structure of the system.
Yeah, I mean, for me, there's one thing which is always interesting. Do we look for the communication between all these things? So then it's a problem where we deal with communications and networking between all these existing systems, which are simulations. Or do we look, and as I know a lot of architects do, for the perfect system which gives us back a guarantee? So, and we do not have to network anymore. And I think there are tendencies to both directions, and I would be really afraid of the last one, because it can't be, and it never. I mean, there tries as well in software to bring all the other packages of software into the same one, but they're never as good as a real one, as an original they try to copy in. Nevertheless, if the communication between the software different packages, just as an example, would be optimized, you would have always the best optimized system on its own, but they would be communicating to each other. So for me, really the interesting point of all dynamic systems is not to have the guarantee of the press a button and have a sustainable building forever, but how do I communicate between all the different perfections from business towards engineering, and how do I make through that clear that not a single man's fountainhead architecture is just brought through. So for me, it's an issue of networking, and that's as well what we try to live as our practice in a way.
Yes, I just wanted to pose a simple question maybe to David, and it's what we initially struggled with when we started to look into the theme of simulation. And it also coming more from the product design side, where scenario thinking is more likely to use. So I would just like you to comment a little bit on what do you think is the difference between a simulation and a scenario. This goes back to the issue of probability and or unprobability, like in worst case scenario, and again prediction. And well, one of my students is dealing with shoe design, and he has a system which really simulates how people dynamically use their shoes, how they work, how they walk with the shoes, and how the pressures in the shoe is dealt with. So this is a simulation which tries to come as near to reality as possible, which is obviously something else than system dynamics deals with. So I just find these differentiations of the notion of simulation very interesting. And yeah.
Thank you. I'm sorry for interrupting. I just want to add something to what Birgit just said, and perhaps frame the discussion into a bit more focused direction in terms of how do we respond to the notion of simulation. And the way I'm going to try and do it is by asking you, members of the table, to refer to simulation and the relation of simulation to actualization. So in a way, I guess what I'm saying is that first I'm asking myself, what is simulation really? And if we are doing simulation, are we trying to only forecast? And that means basically simulation is a form of copying the actualization. Or are we trying to do more than forecast some kind of dynamic behavior of a system? That is, in the process of simulation, we don't necessarily want to get a full copy of actualization, but we want to reach this very, very thin line between simulation and actualization, which can bring creativity to the way we think about the model, or which can allow us to be creative about how we interpret actualization. So what I'm claiming is that there is a certain distance or a certain critical distance between simulation and actualization. And if you look in medical studies, we do simulation in order to get a full copy, or in 3D reconstruction of the body when we want to solve medical problems, we want to get a full copy of the reality, of actualization. When we work in LSC, or when we try to simulate economical behavior or some kind of group dynamics behavior, we still retain some kind of critical distance from actuality in order to be judgmental, or in order to develop some kind of critical seeing or representing, so we can be creative about it and rethink it. So I would like you to, in a way, to refer to this distance between simulation and actuality.
I think that was 2 questions. There were certainly 2 different people involved. So let me deal with the first one. Simulation versus scenario. I think a scenario is a coherent description of a state of affairs in the future. A state of affairs that may come about, so we can come up with a scenario in which, oh dear, that seems terrible, I don't know, the complete collapse of the state of Israel for whatever reason, or warfare in that area. A comment of a piece of information of, I think, complete irrelevance to me and what I'm trying to say, or the collapse of Russia, and then say, in that scenario, what influence does that have on the oil industry? A scenario, I would say, is a sort of a snapshot in time. It's supposed to make internal sense. It's supposed to be internally coherent. A simulation, on the other hand, tells us how things roll forwards in time and gives us the complete path. You were talking about shoes. Let me give you a description in those terms. We simulate the shoe by seeing what happens to the leather as we walk up and down it a lot, and how does it bend and flex. But we might do that in different scenarios, i.e. heavy snowfall. That's a snowfall. That's a scenario. We might not have thought it was very realistic, but then last week happened, or the week before. Okay, that's a scenario. Bright sun is a scenario. Right. Actually, I wanted to make 3 comments. That was the first comment. The second comment is, I know that I have not answered your question. Okay, I just want you to know that. All right, that's because I haven't understood it yet. All right, it's very interesting coming here. Occasionally one breaks out of the particular academic community one finds oneself in and realizes how incredibly specialized the language that one uses is, and how very limited one's worldview is. So I am aware that I haven't answered your question. And I would still like to work out how to do it, okay, because I think it's very interesting. It's dragging me out of my little rut, my terribly rewarding rut. Okay, simulation, actualization. Do you mean actuality? Because the very last time you used the word actualization, you didn't use the word actualization. I think you used the word actuality. Do you mean reality? You mean reality? Splendid. Right. Oh, right. Now reality I can cope with. Okay, it's simulation that's hard. Right. Well, simulation is its, Michael, Greek or Latin word? Simulare. Sounds like Latin, doesn't it? Simulare, to make like. Yeah. To make something that is like. Yes, of course. There's a difference between simulation and reality. It was always thus, and you would want it to be so. You know, you wouldn't want a model that's as complicated as reality, because then it would be as hard to understand as reality. The issue is not are they different, but are they so different that you can't draw any lessons from them. Right? I'm going to take a different view on this, which is what I've found, what systems dynamicists find, is that people's view of what is going on in reality is sometimes so radically incorrect and dangerously so that quite simple models can improve their decision making considerably. And I think there was a point I wanted to make earlier. Michael, I was very interested in your comment about architectural models, the Greek and the Renaissance one, and I wrote down architecture, the model tells me what to build, right? And I immediately wrote after it, system dynamics, the model tells me what to do, in the sense that it's a mental model that I'm interested in. Then I was listening further and I thought, but the new architecture seems to be real-time democracy contributes to the model, which then tells me what to build. And then I was thinking further about what system dynamics is. System dynamics is interested in your mental models, and system dynamics helps me check the validity of the mental model that I have, that then is the source, is the basis of my actions. This is too abstract. Let me give you an example. Everybody in this room has a mental model that's tacit, but it's mostly what they use to guide their actions, and I include myself in this. Here is your, and it's wrong, okay? Here is that mental model. The world is flat, and it has a big hole in the middle, and when I throw stuff away, it goes down that hole and it vanishes forever. Most of us are living our lives in a way consistent with that mental model, and it is wrong, obviously wrong. It is also very dangerously wrong, and you can make people adjust that mental model using a very, very crude representation of reality, and here it is, because one of our colleagues, Dana Meadows, who actually she's now passed away, used to do this with her students at Dartmouth. For a 24-hour period, she would hand them a large black rubbish sack, and the deal was for 24 hours, everything they threw away, they had to put in the sack, and they carried the sack around with them. Then 24 hours later, they come into her class with this big sack, presumably rather smelly and icky, and she has closed the feedback loop. She said, there isn't a hole to throw stuff into, this stuff still exists. How much are we producing? What are we going to do about it? This is an incredibly simple model of reality, but it makes one challenge one's own mental model and therefore leads perhaps to different actions. That's perhaps a rather riffing answer to your question. Well, my prediction is that they
I don't want to. No, for me, it's always an interesting loop between simulation, action, and then the real, because it comes back to the simulation automatically as soon as it became real. And in some cases, we need that as a fast loop, in some cases as a very slow loop. But I believe, yeah, as long as we don't believe that simulation is always a straight line on, there's no learning curve back.
But Theo, can I ask you something? I would just like, with respect to your mark, I would like to reiterate my question from earlier on. Do your installations not depend on the fact that they are not immersed? I mean, in a sense, as a kind of skilling / simulation device of sorts, which we still have to somehow define what exactly is being simulated there. If these devices would be immersed in the environment, they're no longer somehow awkward and different enough from what we deem reality in our living environment in order to register as consciously, let's say, as skilling tools. They become like windows and doors that we open and close in order to make sure that there is more or less airflow in the building. So I'm actually wondering, don't some of these mental models or physical devices by which we kind of challenge our perception or engagement with reality, so to speak, don't these actions depend on the fact that they're not immersed? So I would actually say it would be, from my point of view, the wrong thing to attempt if the purpose is skilling, and skilling the tool as much as the user, to try and somehow eradicate the difference between these tools and, let's say, the building at large. Because then these are doors and windows in a sense, and then they have become somehow reality, no longer that what sets them apart from that.
I mean, ideally, this is a step within a row of things in reality, let's say. So obviously, they're skilling, yes, but with that skill, I might produce a next variation of this, or a completely different one, or just a mental model again, which I can test against simulation. So it shouldn't be, I mean, we as designers shouldn't always think about a final project in that way, and these are not final projects. They become in a finalized stage, which they then can become again a testing ground for the next step.
I don't mean, my question is not referring to finite or not finite project. My question is more about the characteristics of the device at each moment in time in relation to its purpose.
Which is shifting.
Which may be shifting, but then it may actually, this is a question that is trying to tackle the issue of simulation and reality, by which time does, I mean, the question is probably twofold, because there are different aspects. By which time do we accept a model, or by which time does a second generation of researchers accept a model as a kind of given description of reality, right? So it has become immersed in some sort of way and thus doesn't become challenged. Or by which point in time do devices become immersed in the environment that they're no longer distinguishable? They may become the subject matter of a further modeling. So it's not about finite or non-finite. I'm trying to somehow try and see whether we can draw the line where we can say, okay, here we're talking about the model which has a certain purpose, etc., etc., and at some point it no longer is that. Whether that is in our view or whether that is in the way that these for instance, these devices are actually displayed.
Yeah, I mean, there's always the danger that something is becoming standardized, and all of a sudden it doesn't have the impact anymore in the interactivity anymore in the way it wants to produce it. But I believe, again, then it comes to communication. When we bring in communication, for example, with other people who challenge these systems at all times, if I wouldn't accept the door like it is, it can't stay the door it is. So in a way, it's representation, that means, and therefore open for criticism. It's there, it's actual. So therefore vulnerable in a way as well, but therefore always open for change. And yeah, that's why I said as well, it will be training the skills of all sides, not only the designer or the user or the kind of the client. It will, I mean, in an ideal scenario, it goes on. If it starts stopping, as for example in some content management system within media, then it starts dying out.
Then let me rephrase my question. I really enjoyed when David said earlier on, so you do this model, you try to learn from it, and then you throw it away. At which point will you throw your devices away?
At the time, nobody is interacting with them anymore. It's like, I mean, they could be thrown away today if nobody would react with them anymore. They're not precious. I mean,
I think the problem is not about the question is not about the preciousness of the device. The question is, when have you received something from the device as an insight or as a challenge or as a way of looking at an environment which is kind of collectively inhabited, and when has it served its function?
When you look at the first project,
I think I'm saying that because I find you have a well understandable but escapist somehow attitude towards committing yourself. You keep it oftentimes deliberately quite obscure and kind of wide open as to what these devices may do. And I keep asking myself, because this is now the second time that I see the presentation, I wait for this one moment in time where you say, okay, there has got to be a reason for the yellow and the red glove, and this shouldn't change, because if we change that, then we're actually modeling something else which might be equally interesting. But I think a model is not going to tell you anything if you don't have a more precise question at each moment in time. This question may change. But I think it's not good enough to say, well, the question will change. I think what is important, that's how I understand Achim's remark, it's important to say what is the precise nature of that question at each moment in time that will tell us something by using this device or by modeling, by setting up mental models. That is really the...
I mean, it's different in each of the projects. So for example, if you see the first project, which was just presented on screen, it was given automatically that when a research was done, the data was laid out in a way that it was understandable and navigatable for more than just the team itself. They could rephrase their discussion. They try to bring the same into an environment where they can integrate even more people which are not related to the research at all. Came to the first maquettes of that. Obviously there were big failures in that already, so it's working with failures as well, which you have to judge against the criteria you created yourself, or other people are constantly creating for you. And from there on, it's changing. Obviously, the criteria which are set, it's different in each team. Therefore, of course, the answers are different as well from the preciseness. There are, on purpose, and in some moments not too precise in order to communicate easier as well. That might be an answer as well.
I would, because I think it's lunchtime. Okay, so thank you very much.